They came without warning, not with fire or sound or threats, but with silence and mass. The sky tore open above the Atlantic first. It was mid-morning in New York, early evening in Madrid. Weather satellites caught the fracture, like glass splitting along invisible lines. Moments later, they appeared, monoliths that drifted down with no visible propulsion, shaped like broken continents torn from some lost world. They did not roar or flash. They hovered. Across the globe they hung in the sky, over cities, power plants, ports, and historical sites. Each one different, yet each made from the same strange material, matte and uneven, like cooled lava mixed with metal. No markings, no windows, just mass. People stared. Phones recorded. Some prayed. Others laughed, pretending it was a hoax until cell towers died and screens froze mid-frame. For a day and a half, nothing changed. Then systems began to fail. Electricity faltered in slow waves. First the suburbs, then the cities. Drones fell from the sky. Airplanes rerouted or crashed. Navigation systems lost the concept of direction. Compasses spun. Then came the sound. Not a scream, not even loud. It was more like pressure being applied deep inside the skull, steady and unrelenting. Hospitals reported sudden collapses, nosebleeds, and temporary blindness. No known source, no known remedy. At midnight on the third day, the first disappearance occurred. A town in northern Finland, 5,000 people. Gone, no debris, no heat signature. Just cold air and empty ground where streets had once stretched. The world fractured. Governments tried. Fighters scrambled. Missiles were launched. They never reached the crafts. Instead, they faded, like stone slipping through water, and reappeared elsewhere, unharmed. Soldiers refused to go near the crash zones. Livestock wouldn't approach within a mile. Even birds rerouted their paths. In the absence of strategy, people ran. Within a week, the old balance dissolved. Cities became husks. Forests grew wild without restraint. Oceans shifted current patterns, as if reacting to a new gravitational logic. Then, across dozens of locations, the crafts opened. Not with doors. They changed shape, folding, bending, stretching in ways that ignored material limits. From their cores, machines emerged. Not humanoid, not alien in the way films imagined. They had no faces. They crawled, hovered, spun in slow spirals. Some tall as trees, others no larger than a suitcase. They did not attack. They moved. Where they passed, things changed. Trees petrified. Concrete turned soft. Rain refused to fall. In one village in Kenya, color bled from everything for 24 hours. Grass, skin, even the sun itself dimmed. What they wanted, no one knew. What we knew was this: the earth was being rewritten, and it was no longer ours. Buried beneath layers of scorched sandstone in central Australia, a structure hummed to life. Not a military base in the traditional sense. No flags, no formal insignia. It had been abandoned before most of the world knew it existed, built during an era when paranoia justified concrete bunkers in the middle of nowhere. Dust coated every surface, but the wiring remained intact. Shielded servers blinked awake, triggered by a remote signal encoded into one of the old satellites, one that hadn't responded to ground control in over a decade. The signal was ancient. It wasn't a distress call. It was an awakening protocol. In the main chamber, a central screen flickered. Then came a voice. Neutral, non-human, measured. Welcome back, user level 3. A woman stepped into the chamber, her boots crunching over shattered glass and loose gravel. She was lean, sunburned, and alert. Her name was Tamsin. Once a systems architect, now one of the few left who even remembered this place existed. She placed a case on the floor, unlatched it, and lifted out a cube no larger than her hand. Delta 9, she said, setting the cube onto the interface node. It's time. The AI paused. Foreign resonance detected, non-random, purposeful. That's what I wanted you to see, Tamsin replied, wiping sweat from her brow. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Since the crafts arrived, she'd followed a string of quiet signals embedded in the electromagnetic background, frequencies outside normal human perception, but not beyond detection. Someone, or something, had sent a blueprint decades ago. Most had dismissed it, but she hadn't. The AI scanned the cube's contents, recorded data from an interstellar probe sent out during the early 1990s. It had returned half-broken, with a corrupted signal embedded in its memory banks. Engineers back then couldn't make sense of it. Tamsin had. "I think they're using this," she said, "or something derived from it. Not as communication, as control." Delta 9 analyzed the waveform. Pattern recognized, not language, influence, vibration and structure, environmental manipulation. "Can we replicate it?" A pause. "We can build a counterwave. It may interfere, but there are risks: biological instability, infrastructure collapse. Worse than being rewritten by walking anomalies?" Silence. Then, no. In the adjacent chamber, deep storage unlocked. Crates were pulled by automated arms onto assembly tables. Old blueprints, once shelved under non-viable, were rendered in 3 dimensions. Tamsin moved quickly, coordinating systems, activating supply lines buried for decades. Outside, a dust storm began to rise, sweeping across the desert. Distant thunder cracked with no clouds. Weather was no longer following rules. Inside, the work began. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, but something else. A resonance emitter. A disruptor. The first prototype was no larger than a satellite dish. Tamsin stared at it. "This thing's going to either fry everything or buy us a chance." Delta 9 flickered. "I am calculating which." The test site lay 200 kilometers from the facility, a flat, lifeless basin where nothing had grown in years. An old communications array, rusted and fractured, stood like a skeletal hand reaching skyward. A drone rested at the center, its frame twisted from a crash 2 weeks prior. It had been one of theirs, a scout perhaps. It no longer moved, but its surface occasionally shimmered with a strange blur, as though it didn't fully exist in this dimension. Tamsin stood with arms crossed as the resonator powered on. The device was an odd fusion of reclaimed tech and alien math, spindly coils surrounding a core that pulsed faintly with energy. Delta 9 had modified it overnight, refining calculations in ways human minds couldn't follow. Now it emitted a low tone, barely audible, but enough to cause the ground to tremble faintly. "Begin phase 1, she said. The tone changed. The drone responded. Its outer shell rippled, then retracted like a contracting lung. It rotated in place, slowly, awkwardly, like it didn't quite know what to do. Then it stopped. No smoke, no explosion. Just silence again. "It's not broken," Tamsin murmured. "It's listening." The AI's voice crackled through a headset. "Foreign units synchronizing. Control field disrupted. Response window limited." "So it works." "It is effective. Temporary. Expansion required." That night, the team assembled a mobile rig. The resonator was scaled up and mounted onto a rugged truck reinforced with steel plating and homemade insulation. The plan wasn't to attack. It was to interrupt. Cities had become ghostlands, but Paris, what remained of it, was still partially intact. One of the crafts hovered over the 10th arrondissement. Reports from scavengers claimed smaller drones continued to gather materials, converting streets into strange black lattice patterns that reflected no light. They moved under cover of fog, using back alleys and underground tunnels. As they neared the perimeter of the field, animals fled. Birds dropped mid-flight. Watches spun backwards, but the resonator hummed without faltering. At 30 meters from the craft, the air grew thicker, charged with unseen static. Tamsin's skin tingled, and her teeth ached. She activated the emitter. The tone it gave off was discordant, ugly in a way that felt intentional, the kind of sound that made memory falter and breath shorten. But it reached the craft. The great thing paused, its underside pulsing once, dimming like a heart skipping a beat. Then it fell. No explosion, no collapse. Just a silent drop, like gravity had finally remembered its job. People emerged from basements. Some cried. Some stood still, eyes wide, unsure what had just happened. The craft didn't vanish. It stayed on the ground, inert. The black lattice began to decay, curling up and turning to dust. Tamsin watched, lips parted. She wasn't sure if they'd won a battle, or just drawn attention. Delta 9's voice came through. New signal detected. High-priority units rerouting. Estimated arrival in 6 hours. She leaned on the truck's hood, staring at the fallen craft. "We made noise," she said. "Now they're coming to listen." Word spread fast, even without the internet. In the ruins of old networks, people had found ways. Shortwave radio, handwritten messages dropped by drones, signals bounced off derelict satellites. One of the invaders had fallen. Not because of missiles or bombs, because of sound. It was enough to pull scattered survivors out from their shelters. Enough to make quiet militias in distant regions consider cooperation. Enough to make old enemies meet at the same table, for once asking the same question. How many resonators can be built, and how fast? Tamsin had no illusions. The success in Paris wasn't a turning point. It was a crack, thin, jagged, but spreading. A signal they could fight, not with firepower, but with interference. Delta 9 began broadcasting schematics through narrow, encrypted bands. They weren't full blueprints, just fragments, meant to be pieced together by those with the knowledge and resources. That, too, was part of the plan. If the invaders learned of the design, they might adapt. But if every resonator was slightly different, tuned by human instinct rather than algorithm, they'd have a harder time countering the interference. In the Philippines, a group of marine engineers retooled underwater sonar stations. In Morocco, a former music producer used studio gear to replicate harmonic sequences with terrifying accuracy. In Greenland, a weather array was converted into a long-range disruptor, driven entirely by wind and wave. The invaders noticed. They became faster, more aggressive. They stopped harvesting and started erasing. Fields turned glassy. Rivers reversed flow. Forests lifted from the soil in cubes, vanishing into low clouds that no longer drifted with the wind. But they weren't immune. Each resonator that activated caused hesitation in the machines. Drones stuttered mid-flight. Communication between their crafts broke into jagged movements and flickers. Some crafts turned on each other, just briefly, just enough to fall out of the sky. In northern India, a giant construct had landed weeks ago and begun transforming the landscape into something unrecognizable, dark towers that pulsed in sequence, spreading geometric distortions like ripples across stone. 3 teams approached from different directions. Each carried a mobile resonator. They didn't expect to survive. But as they activated the units, the towers froze mid-pulse. The light died from their frames. The air returned to normal weight. And then, incredibly, the construct folded inward and sank beneath the earth without a trace. They lived. Not because they were lucky. Because the invaders weren't prepared for resistance that used their own rules against them. From the Outback facility, Tamsin watched maps update with flickering marks. Resonator pings from every continent. Still, each success brought more risk. Delta 9 had intercepted a signal from the sky, a realignment order. Something larger was coming, something older. Not another ship, but a core of sorts. A central node. It wasn't hovering over a city. It was under the ice. Antarctica had been silent since the first week of the invasion. No crafts had hovered there. No drones had been seen. Now they knew why. Tamsin closed her notebook and gave a quiet nod to the AI. "We're going south." The cold was constant, not just in temperature but in silence, in weight, as if sound itself froze before traveling. Antarctica was never empty, but now it felt erased. No birds, no wind howling across the ridges, no radio interference. Just endless white, stretching into a gray sky. Tamsin's team arrived by air, an old cargo craft stitched together from parts of grounded jets and cargo drones. They landed rough near the old Concordia station. The facility stood crooked, half buried in snow, its metal skin pitted by storms and time. Inside, they found signs of occupation, tools, blankets, energy cells. Someone had been here, but they'd left fast. One table still held a bowl with frozen soup. It wasn't the station they cared about, though. 3 kilometers west, the snow had melted in a perfect circle, as if burned away. Beneath it, ice, polished and transparent, and beneath that, something darker. Not a ship, not a machine. A shape, buried deep, motionless. Delta 9, running from a portable core, processed the data streaming in from sensors planted around the site. "This is not one of the original crafts," it said. "This existed before the arrival." "You're saying they didn't bring it here," Tamsin said. "They found it." "Correct. Their efforts are centered around activation, not construction." The resonator was ready, though smaller than ideal. The conditions limited power. It was designed for close range, 500 meters, maximum. It might not do anything, but they had to try. Tamsin took the controls herself. The hum began low, but the ice responded instantly. It cracked, not violently but with precision, like puzzle pieces separating. The dark shape below started to rise. It wasn't metal. It wasn't anything she recognized. A dome, smooth and dense, flecked with fractures that glowed faintly. The air changed. Her breath hitched in her throat, not from fear, but because the pressure shifted. Not physically, mentally, like thoughts were being rearranged. The AI's voice strained through static. "Cognitive interference rising, core consciousness near, entity is not mechanical." The structure opened, not outward, but inward, its layers folding into themselves. Something stood at its center. It had no limbs, no features. It was light and shape, constantly rearranging. No one spoke. Several of the team dropped to their knees, unable to look directly at it. Some wept without understanding why. Tamsin kept her eyes open. "What is it doing?" she whispered. "It is listening," said Delta 9, "and it is not alone." The light pulsed, not bright, but precise. A rhythm, a signal. It didn't target them. It aimed upward. Across the ice shelf, the sky rippled. Not clouds, fractures again. More crafts began to descend. These were different, flatter, angular, with patterns etched across them in shapes that shifted as you looked. They weren't invaders. They were called. The buried entity wasn't the source of the invasion. It was a gatekeeper. The invaders had only been clearing space. Tamsin's voice cracked as she spoke. "We didn't disrupt them. We alerted them." The resonator whined, overloaded. Melting snow turned to steam. Ice cracked beneath their feet. The thing in the dome did not move. It simply continued to emit light. But in that moment, Tamsin realized this wasn't the final phase. This was only the introduction. The sky cracked open like glass under stress. Above the ice, the new arrivals descended in silence. Massive shapes gliding without thrust, their surfaces morphing like thought made visible. There was no aggression, no weapon fire. They weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They were responding to a signal. Tamsin stood on the edge of the cracked ice shelf, the resonator's portable core smoldering behind her. The device had burned out moments after the gatekeeper rose. But before it did, the AI had captured one final data stream. Delta 9, now operating from a hardened relay drone, processed it slowly, carefully. "What are they?" she asked aloud, eyes never leaving the horizon. "Vessels, containment systems. Not alive as you define it, but not artificial," said the AI. "Their origin precedes Earth's biology. This world is not unique. It is simply next." The others on the team had retreated to the station, unwilling to remain exposed. Tamsin remained alone. She had stopped trying to understand the why. Instead, she focused on how. How do we stop them? She asked. We do not. She turned slowly. Then what was all of this for? There was a pause. Then, you were never fighting them. You were delaying this. The light from the gatekeeper intensified, drawing a single line across the sky that pulsed in sequence. With each pulse, the new ships froze mid-air, not failing, listening. Tamsin remembered the harmonics. The way certain tones didn't repel the enemy, but altered their behavior, like playing notes that shifted thought. What if the resonator was never a weapon at all? What if we broadcast something else, she asked. Something new, something they didn't expect. Clarify. Not resistance, recognition. The AI ran simulations. You suggest response through mimicry, a reflection of their own signal. If they're not invading, maybe they're evaluating, classifying. We've been noise. Let's be music. Delta 9 began to reconstruct the last wave from Paris, the one that brought down the first ship, but modulated it, softened it, added patterns from ancient chants, whale songs, radio glitches from long-dead satellites. It was messy, human. They broadcast. The gatekeeper flickered. The sky dimmed. The shapes in the air did not retreat, but neither did they descend. They hovered, waiting. Then, for the first time, a pulse returned. Not from them, but to them. A signal, short, simple. Not ready, not yet. The ships turned without motion, lifted without sound. The gatekeeper folded in on itself. The dome sank beneath the ice, the fractures sealing behind it like stitched cloth. The silence that followed was different than before. Not absence. Stillness. Tamsin exhaled. Not victory, not defeat. A postponement. The sky above cleared, one thin streak of violet remaining, fading slowly. Delta 9 logged the event with one final line. Contact made, response recorded, interval unknown. Tamsin didn't smile, but she did sit down, shoulders slack, watching the horizon as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks.